everybody, it's Eric Pappenfuss. It's Friday, so it must be a buy day. It's gotten a little chillier outside, so we're indoors today at our beautiful collectibles room where we're talking about one of my favorite categories of books, books about travel and adventure. And you can find many of them here. We're going to talk about one that just came in from a bookstore in upstate New York. And it is a book which is considered the first work in English on the subject of Egyptology. And no, it wasn't by Wallace Budge, it wasn't by Howard Carter, it was by an individual known as the Great Belzoni. Now, Belzoni was a 6'7" giant of a man who rose to prominence in the circus. And he performed an act called the Human Pyramid, in which he carried 12 individuals across the stage, 12 grown men at one time. Emily, an extraordinary feat. In his 40s, he grew tired of the stage and decided to go to England to seek his fortune. And from England, he went on to Egypt. And there, at the time, there was a battle between the French and the English for control over the great antiquities that were throughout the region. The Louvre wanted things, the British Museum wanted things, and Belzoni was hired to go down the Nile to the ancient capital of Egypt to salvage a bust of Ramses II that was so large and so heavy, the French had been unable to move it. Now, all great travel books have maps. This one is no exception. It's in pretty nice condition. This is of the Nile, and you can see the delta here. And Belzoni went down the river to get this giant bust of Ramses II. Here is an image, Emily, of him using the ancient Egyptian techniques of a sort of sled on logs to pull this and get it on board a ship and ship it back to the British Museum. The bust is still in the British Museum today. Now, most of this book is extraordinary because it reads like an Indiana Jones story. He had a bullwhip, he fought assassins left and right, and he crawled and crawled and crawled in various tombs, including he was the first person to penetrate the central pyramid of the Great Pyramids of Giza. I'm going to read to you a little bit of the book to give you a flavor of Belzoni. He was an extraordinary writer, and this is nothing like the other Regency literature of the time. Imagine putting down Jane Austen and picking up Belzoni and reading about the dust that he found when he entered the tomb. In such a situation, I found myself several times and often returned exhausted and fainting, till at last I became inured to it and indifferent to what I suffered, except for the dust, which never failed to choke my throat and nose. And though fortunately I am destitute of the sense of smelling, I could taste that the mummies were rather unpleasant to swallow. That is the Great Belzoni. Now, later in life, he goes back to England. He has an amazingly popular exhibit in Piccadilly in which he is the first to perform a mummy unwrapping. His techniques today are sort of frowned upon and scorned, and he really does sort of represent a tomb raider or a tomb plunderer. But there was another side to Belzoni, which was that he kept meticulous notes and meticulous records. There's a second book to this that we don't have, unfortunately, which is a plate book in which he kept drawings and measurements of everything that he saw. He is considered, for better or for worse, one of the founders of Egyptology, the Great Belzoni. Now we're going to go back in time, Emily, from the Regency to the Georgian period, and we're going to talk about a shipwreck, specifically the shipwreck of an East India trader ship known as the Antelope. And here is this account, an account of the Palau Islands. And where were the Palau Islands, you might say? Well, the Palau Islands were off the coast of the Philippines, and here is the great map in this work, which you can see. The expedition left China, through the Philippines, went over to the Palau Islands, where they wrecked. Now, I find this story interesting for two reasons. One, because there was a great British artist on board, and unlike other travel accounts, that artist, Arthur Debus, was able to capture, really for the first time, the spirit and the complexities of what he saw, including these incredible portraits of the king and queen of the inhabitants of the islands. And here is Abathul, the great king. He also did a wonderful job of capturing what the archipelago must have looked like from on board the Antelope, Here's a beautiful fold-out plate. You can see all the different islands and all of their sort of splendor that would have been observed at the time. Now, Devis goes on to paint a famous portrait called The Death of Nelson. He knows all about the sort of apotheosis and the ability to create a myth. And he sort of does that in his portraits in this book. But what really interests me is that most of the book is actually a biography of a prince by the name of Li Bu, who is the second son of the king. And Li Bu goes back with the crew of the Antelope to London, where he is feted as the great Black Prince. Now, this book is really the first book to focus on, in terms of biography, on a non-white individual to be sort of widely read in British history. It is published the year before Equiano's narratives of his life. Later editions of this work, they just drop the entire first half entirely, and they call it instead The Interesting Life of Li Bu. Li Bu is fascinating. He encounters all sorts of interesting aspects of British society at the time. He even gets to see the first ascent of a hydrogen balloon by another Italian. This Italian was named Lenardi. Li Bu was not impressed by the rise of the hot air balloon. Eventually, he travels and he meets an individual by the name of Brooke Watson. He stays at Brooke Watson's house, where he dies, unfortunately, of smallpox. A brief life, but one that is immortalized, and you can read the inscription on his tombstone and everything else in this book. I just wanted to end today by noting that Brooke Watson is fascinating in art history as well, because he is the subject of the most famous painting by John Singleton Copley called Watson and the Shark. And if you go to the National Gallery in Washington, D.C., you can see this painting in all of its glory. Brooke Watson has his legs severed by a shark in Havana Harbor and is rescued by the sailors on the boat. And he would have undoubtedly showed this portrait to Li Bu. He was very, very proud of the portrait. And I'd like to sort of ask how Li Bu may have seen himself in the portrait. We know that Brooke Watson wanted Li Bu to see himself as Brooke Watson, because Brooke Watson, when he died, donated the portrait to an orphanage so that it could yield moral instruction in the youth. Youth could see a story of overcoming adversity and rising to great things, becoming a great wealthy trader for the East India Company, for example, despite losing one's leg. But I suspect Li Bu saw himself through the eyes of the black sailor at the top of the portrait, the top of the triangle, or the top of the pyramid. The black sailor is literally trying to hold the boat together, a balance between these two worlds. He's holding a rope, he's holding out his hand to Brooke Watson. And this would have been the last image that Li Bu saw before he died at Brooke Watson's home. Well, today we're going to end with a funny book. It is in the theme of travel, and that is a book with a question that I have not asked myself in a very long time, and that is, where's Dan Quayle? And quite amusingly, Emily, I'm not sure that many people know who Dan Quayle is today, but Dan Quayle was, of course, one of our least memorable vice presidents. And here, for instance, is an image of Where's Dan Quayle. And I'd like you to just pan over the image of Where's Dan Quayle, and I would ask you, if you're watching at home, see if you can identify where Dan Quayle is and let us know, and put his whereabouts in the comments on YouTube for everybody to see and to share. You might see Khrushchev, you might see a KGB assassin, you might see Genghis Khan, but can you find Dan Quayle? A question we're all asking ourselves. In fact, if you type Dan Quayle into Google right now, the first thing that'll come up is, where's Dan Quayle? We don't know. Hey, well, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed another edition of Buy Day. We'll see you next Friday and every Friday at noon for adventures in the world of books.